Dr. Strand, and welcome to my spinal cord pathways presentation. I'm going to be talking about the spinocerebellar first, both the ventral and the rostral tracts. So the spinocerebellar is an important pathway, and it functions to receive proprioception information, and it coordinates balance. It uses mechanoreceptors, and an example is in like Golgi tendons and tendon stretch. So the inputs are proprioception, joint movement, tendon stretch. And proprioception is just basically like your unconscious ability to be able to know where your body is at all times. First, talking about the ventral part of the spinocerebellar. So first, the ventral is for the inferior joints, and it starts in the dorsal horn of the lumbar, and it has its first synapse here. It's the synapses between the joint afferents from T6 and below, and it synapses with border cells. So it comes through and it immediately crosses over through the anterior white commissure in the lumbar, and it travels right up and it keeps going kind of on this ventrolateral edge of the lateral funiculus, and it travels all the way up and enters in through the superior peduncle in the cerebellum. But right in here on the cervical level is where the rostral part of this tract starts, and this is for superior joints. So here it enters in through the dorsal horn of the cervical, and this is where it has its first synapse here as well, and that's between the joint afferent neurons from T5 and above, and they synapse with dorsal horn neurons. So there's the rostral pathway that kind of they run alongside and travel up. This rostral stays ipsilateral, it does not cross over, and then they both the only difference is that this rostral enters through the inferior peduncle. It enters the cerebellum, so that structure is in the cerebellum. It wasn't able to be shown on this diagram, the peduncles, but I put the picture of this man walking on the balance beam because the cerebellum is often the center for balance and coordination. So there he is. And yeah, the spinocerebellar pathway would definitely be in play if you were walking on the balance beam. The next pathway I'm going to be talking about is the dorsal column system. This is shown on my diagram in brown, and its function is to respond to touch, pressure, vibration, and joint position. So that would be the inputs would be touch, pressure, vibration. So there's two tracks for this dorsal column system. One is the mechanico-sensory receptors that enter at the lumbar, and this is for the lower body. And then another part is the mechanosensory receptors that enter at the cervical, and then they kind of join together at that cervical level and continue up together. So I will show you on my diagram now. So here we have the track for the lower body. It's entering at that the primary neurons ascend in the dorsal column, and this is at the lumbar level, and they travel up, and this one synapses in the gracile, and the upper one synapses in the cuneate nuclei of the lower medulla. So they both kind of meet together in this lower medulla. As you can see here on the cervical, that is where the upper body primary neurons enter. So they both synapse in different locations in the lower medulla, and then the secondary neurons cross across this medial lemniscus, and then they travel together and ascend through the medial meniscus of the upper medulla. So then they ascend. Then they ascend through the medial lemniscus of the midbrain and continue up. as you can see, they went contralateral together, and then they continue up. And then the secondary neurons synapse in the ventral postolateral nucleus of the thalamus, and these neurons project to different parts. Excuse me. In the internal capsule of the post-central gyrus region, and this is important because the different areas that these are, the body parts where they are, correspond to the body part where the primary neuron originated. So yeah, here I have a picture of somebody getting a foot massage. This would be the dorsal column tract would be in play because pressure is applied, and so the body would respond to those. So yeah, there is my dorsal column. The next tract I'm going to be talking about is the spinothalamic tract, and this is represented on my diagram in orange. The function is to respond to pain and temperature sensation, and there's two different tracts for this: anterior spinothalamic and lateral spinothalamic. And the anterior tract transmits info about crude touch and pressure, and the lateral spinal tract, lateral spinothalamic tract carries pain and temp sensations. So I'm going to be talking about that lateral tract. So the input for this would be pain and temperature sensory. And so first, in the lumbar section, the A delta primary neurons enter the spinal cord and synapse immediately onto that secondary neuron in the laminae 1 and 5 of the dorsal gray horn. So then they immediately cross over through the anterior white commissure and ascend as a tract in the ventrolateral funiculus. And as you can see on this cervical level, we have some entering and crossing over through that anterior white commissure, and then ascending in the tract through the pons, medulla pons midbrain, and the ventral postolateral nucleus of the thalamus is where they enter, kind of similar to that last tract. And this again, they synapse in this ventral posterior nucleus of the thalamus, and then the tertiary neurons start. And this also goes into the internal capsule of the post-central gyrus, and its location is also for the body part where the primary neuron originated. So here is that up into the brain. And for this, I have a hand on fire because it corresponds to pain and sensory. So that would go up into the brain. And then also this one for the hand would enter at that cervical level, not the lumbar. So it would travel up here. The secondaries would synapse in the thalamus into the tertiaries, and then the part of this the internal capsule of the post-central gyrus would correspond for that hand. So that is the spinothalamic tract here in orange. And then the yellow is the tertiary neurons that correspond for that. So now I'm going to start with the descending pathways, and the first one I have is a corticospinal tract. I'm going to be doing the anterior branch or tract, but I have it starting in the area for the thumb and the wrist, and the function of this is for complex voluntary movements of torso and limbs, specifically fine motor movements of hands and feet. So the outputs then, since it's a descending, would be movement of the upper body, since I'm doing that, and specifically the fingers. So here it is, starting in the region of the motor cortex for the part of the fingers. The primary neurons of the motor cortices descend through the internal capsule. They descend through the cerebral peduncle of the midbrain, then through the pons and medulla. The primary neurons stay ipsilateral and they are anterior tract in the ventromedial funiculus. So once they get to this level, they cross at the anterior white commissure of the lower medulla, and these primary neurons then synapse with, there it crosses over. These primary neurons then synapse with the premotor inner neurons in the ventral horn, and that's the first synapse. And then sometimes they synapse directly with the motor neurons. And yeah, so they cross over right here in that anterior white commissure, and then they come down to the cervical for movement of the hands and fingers. And that's it. The next descending pathway I'm going to talk about is the cerebrospinal, and that's represented by purple on my model. Its function is to support large motor movements and fine motor skills. It facilitates flexor muscles and inhibits extensor muscles. So the inputs for these is magnocellular neurons that receive inputs from motor cortices, and the outputs is movement of hand and arm. So yeah, I will show you that on my model. So the cerebrospinal tract starts in the red nucleus of the midbrain, and it crosses immediately, and the magnocellular axons, or the primary neurons, descend through the lateral brainstem near the lateral corticospinal tract. So you can see, follow them down. Here we go, and then we get to the cervical spinal level, and that is for the movement of the upper limbs. So as you can see on my picture, there's a guy flexing his arm muscles. And so then this is when the first synapse happens, and the magnocellular primary neurons synapse onto lower motor neurons in the ventral spinal cord gray matter, onto motor neurons for the flexor muscles of the upper limbs. So this is important because inner neurons are used to inhibit the extensor muscles, and then the primary, or the major motor neurons are then used to excite the flexor muscles. And yeah, there you go. My next spinal cord pathway for the descending part is the vestibulospinal, which I'm going to be talking specifically about the lateral tract, which is responsible for extensor muscles. So this is going to be represented by a teal piece of yarn on my spinal cord, and the function is for supporting balance and directing movements of muscles to support balance. So the inputs of these, your ear is actually really important because the otolith organs and the semicircular canals send inputs to regulate this. You may have heard of like the crystals in your ears for people that experience vertigo. That is related to this balance, that like nauseous, spinning, or like loss of balance feeling. And then the output is just maintaining balance and coordination of the muscles to do that. So yeah, I'll show you on my structure. So to get to this point, there's a big process to get the inputs to this part of the spinal cord, but basically mechanical opening of channels and hair cells of the semicircular canal, the ampulla for rotation, and the saccule and utricle for tilt and translational movement. They depolarize the vestibular neurons, and these vestibular axons synapse with cells in the vestibular nuclei of the brainstem, and then the vestibular axons form this lateral vestibular tract, and this descends through the brainstem and through the ventral funiculus of the spinal cord. And then this is where the lateral tract of the vestibulospinal tract begins. It starts from the lateral vestibular nucleus in the middle medulla and descends ipsilateral, so it stays on the same side, and goes down to this lumbar section, and this is when they synapse with lower motor neurons, and they use inner neurons at all spinal cord levels in the ventral gray horn, and these are responsible for inhibition of the flexor muscles. And so the synapses with inner neurons, and then motor neurons, which activate the extensor muscles. So there is that, and here is my picture. It is a little picture of crystals and somebody losing their balance. And this is just to remind me that the different parts of the ear play an important role in this system, and it's for balance. So there you go. My next descending pathway is the tectospinal tract, which is only the cervical. It is represented on my model in pink, and its function is to mediate reflective head and neck movements in response to visual stimuli. And so its inputs is visual inputs, and then the outputs is movement of the head and neck towards the direction of the visual stimuli. And yeah, so I'll show you on my model. So here it is the pink string on the left. It starts at the superior colliculus in the midbrain, and the superior colliculus axons cross in the dorsal tegmental desiccation between the red nuclei, and it descends through the brain stem all the way down to the cervical spinal cord as the tectospinal tract. So it descends near the longitudinal fasciculus, and it synapses with inner neurons and motor neurons in the spinal cord, cervical spinal cord ventral gray horn. And this synapse is of the primary neurons to the secondary neurons. And yeah, so an important indicator of this tectospinal is that it crosses over at that dorsal tegmental desiccation, which its little buddy, the interstitial spinal tract, does not do. That stays ipsilateral, and I'll be talking about that next. So my final descending tract is the interstitiospinal, and this is for cervical and thoracic. The last one was just cervical, stopped at the cervical, but this one can go down to thoracic. Its function is the coordination of head and eye movement, specifically stabilizing eyes during head movement, postural adjustments, and balance. And the inputs for this is visual and vestibular inputs. The outputs are balance and motor coordination. And so here, I'll show you on my model. So the interstitiospinal tract axons start in the interstitial nucleus of Cajal in the midbrain, and the axons descend on the brain stem on the ipsilateral side with the medial longitudinal fasciculus. And then you get down to either the cervical or the thoracic, so you can see right here. And it synapses with inner neurons and motor neurons in the ventral gray horn of the cervical spinal cord for the neck, or with synapses with inner neurons and motor neurons in the ventral gray horn of the thoracic spinal cord for axial trunk muscles. That's what I'm showing here. And an important indicator of this tract is that it stays ipsilateral. So here you can see a picture of a baby. No, sorry. You can see it, yeah. This is just a picture for actually the last one turning its head towards this should actually be moved down one, but this will be on this, but it's for the turning of a head to an auditory sound, so that I will move right there. But yeah, that's my picture for this one.